Oh God, by your Spirit, move in and through these words that they may become your living word for us. And then, having heard it, enable us to be your living and loving witnesses. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O God, our Lord, and our Redeemer. Amen. We are at the end of Matthew's Gospel. The final words Jesus says to the disciples before leaving them, these are those words. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always, to the end of the age. This is the word of our Lord. Thanks be to God. So as I begin the service, this is an acknowledgement that this Sunday is Trinity Sunday. For some of you, there may not be all that much interest in talking about the Trinity, but I think there's some value for us, not from a theological standpoint, but from how we might live our lives more faithfully. It began in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, when they finally got all the Christians from the Roman world together because the empire was ripping apart over issues of theology. I know it's hard to imagine that. And one of the questions they sought to ask was, what is the nature of Jesus Christ? Who was he? Some said he was a sort of ghost. Others said he was only human. Others said he was some sort of strange mixture of both, and that is actually what we ended up with. This idea that Jesus is fully human and fully divine at the same time, and anytime you say something about Jesus, it's probably heresy, because you've ignored one part of that. We can thank the council for that wonderful work. One bit of funny note is they came together, they had these agreements, and then they went home and none of their practices changed. Folks who were preaching heresy continued to preach heresy, and eventually it did die out, although it continues to raise its head in some interesting ways even now. But I'm not interested in giving a history lesson, and I'm sure you're not interested in any more of that. But the question is for us, is the Trinity is fundamental for us as Christians, whether we want to spend much time with it or not. It is the fundamental difference between our beliefs of our Jewish brothers and sisters and our Muslim brothers and sisters. We believe that Jesus was God incarnate. Now, I'm not interested in making sure that you have the proper Orthodox faith. Orthodoxy is not all that interesting to me. Orthopraxy, some of you might have heard that term before, seems a whole lot more interesting. In other words, living out what you actually believe. You might say you believe something properly, but it does nothing to further the kingdom of God. So let me share why I think it's important to the life of faith to go back and talk about the Trinity. And I say this as someone who's never really been interested in it, at least from a preaching standpoint. The question for us is, how do we understand the nature of God? We have to step back from time to time and say, who is this God who we worship? And what does that mean for our lives? That's what we do each week when we gather together. But frankly, the kinds of questions we ought to ask each day when we go to work and we do our work, and where we shop and where we live and how we use the resources we've been given are all ways for us to answer those questions, even if we don't give them the words. The answer is, how do we know about God? We as Christians believe it is through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the embodiment of God's love on earth, which means to understand the nature of God, we have to go back to Jesus, which I'm really much happier to do. Why is that? Well, I'm able to relate much more to this idea of someone who lived and loved and served, and the stories are so rich, than I am, in some ways, being comfortable with this divine mystery. Doesn't mean I don't believe it. It's just a lot easier for me, and I think for the church, to start with Jesus and go from there. Who was he? What did he do? How did he live? Those are the questions that we ought to ask. Too often, though, in scholarship circles, it's becoming an idea of, well, how much was he real? Was he historically there? I love when the movement came together, the Jesus Seminar, and they voted on what they thought, as renowned scholars, which parts of the gospel were true, which could have happened, which absolutely did not happen. And then they passed it down. Individually, those scholars are amazing. Together, it was the worst piece of scholarship I've ever seen. I'm not alone. But what did Jesus do? What we have is the witness of the Scriptures. So we have to go back to that. And one of the places I like to go back is when Jesus first speaks. In Luke's Gospel, when he first announces what his ministry will be about, it is about proclaiming freedom for the oppressed, sight to the blind, prisoners being set free. Jesus begins his ministry by talking about liberation. Liberation. What did it look like? Well, Jesus fed people and didn't ask whether they were worthy of the food or not. Jesus healed people without asking whether or not they had Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Jesus then taught people how to do the same, to share food, to share love, to work, and to bring healing outside of the ways of empire. No, Jesus did not directly take on the empire, but he knew that if he took his ragtag followers to take on the empire, they would have ended up dead. So he taught them something else. When you cannot change your external circumstances, liberate your mind and your heart, and liberate your mind and the hearts of your neighbors. It's how you live faithfully in the midst of empire. Yep, it's still talking about the Trinity, by the way. It didn't necessarily change what was going on, but the invitation that Jesus calls the followers to come and be part of is the liberation which begins first in the minds and hearts of the followers. The liberation we're talking about is the kind that says, you may have control over me, but you don't own my mind and my spirit and my soul. So I am free, even though I am not. That's the beginning of liberation. This is what it means to be made in the image of God, as people who are made in the image of a triune God who brought liberation through the voice and life of Jesus Christ. That means we as followers of Jesus are called to that same liberation in our minds, in our hearts, and in our communities. How can you be part of the liberation of the world if you aren't being liberated in your own mind and heart? So let's go back to the Trinity for a moment. The nature of the Trinity is communal. This is what separates us. We are not radical monotheists. Fancy term you can throw around at dinner. We are people of the Trinity. Leonardo Boff was a Latin American liberation theologian, is a Latin American liberation theologian. I didn't mean to kill him off right there. He wrote a book a number of years ago called Trinity and Community, and he was quickly censored by the Catholic Church. His understanding of the Trinity as communal is foundational for why I still think the Trinity matters a lot. In other words, this idea that the Trinity is not solitary. So we as human beings are not solitary. No longer do we believe just because I think I am fully human. Without community, we can't be fully human. It is out of his teaching that we are able to make this connection between the Trinity being communal and that we, as people who are made in the image of God, are made to be in relationship with other people. But not just any sorts of relationships, just and loving and liberating relationships. And if they are not, that is the essence of sin. So sin becomes the exclusion of other people. The rejection of equal relationships in community. And what got Boff in so much trouble was that he finally rejected the hierarchy that many believe are part of the essence of God. Father, Son, Spirit, he said, no, co-equal relationships. If they are all God, they are all God. No one is a lesser than God. It means that we are not fully human by ourselves. We cannot live alone, despite what our culture tells us. You are a consumer. You don't need other people. Just buy stuff and you'll feel good. It means that when we are not in relationships that are loving and just and liberating, that we are not living out our God-given identity. When we are in conflict with others, when we say others are not even human, you might have heard that this week. Political figures calling large swaths of the American public not even human. When that happens, we call it for what it is, sin, the antithesis of the faith of Jesus Christ. We may be in conflict with other people. We may think they're wrong, but we cannot question the humanity of anyone else. When the explorers, use that term loosely, the invaders from the Iberian Peninsula came to the United States and the Central and South America, right? They struggled with the idea of whether or not these new people they met were in fact human at all. And so they had their theologians work this over and tried to figure out, were they in fact human? And their answer is, not really, no. And so we can enslave them. You see how this slippery slope works. When we are not in equal and just or loving relationships, not just in our community of people that we actually know, but in the larger community, when our systems and society and neighborhoods and cities and states are broken and unjust, it is sin. It is something Christians cannot stand behind. And when Christians do, we must tell them they're wrong. This is what it means to be in relationships with our brothers and sisters who clearly don't agree with our view. We are, as I've reminded my kids who encounter other Christians, one who in particular wouldn't talk to them anymore when she had a different understanding about reproductive rights for females. I said, honey, we're part of the Presbyterian Church. Our part of the Reformed tradition is a minority voice, and we have to know our theology really well because we will walk into the world and people will wonder what planet we came from, whether or not we actually love Jesus or not. This is why we have to go back to these doctrines. So our faith and looking at the Trinity is not an intellectual exercise alone. It has concrete importance for how we will live and relate and be in the world. It's not simply making sure that you believe the right things. Because the truth is, whether you believe it or not is no consequence to God at all. Our belief does not make something true. The earth is not flat, no matter how hard some folks may try to make it. What matters is how we are participating in the liberation for which Jesus calls us. When Jesus says to the disciples finally, go out into all the nations and baptize them and proclaim the gospel to them. Historically, that has been something that those of us who are part of the mainline liberal church, as we want to call that, or may not want to claim that, I leave that up to you, we've often been uncomfortable with it because it felt a bit triumphalistic. But isn't that how Christendom worked? It went everybody, everywhere, and made sure to baptize and kill off anybody who didn't see the Christianity the way we did. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here at the end. How can someone who begins his ministry by preaching liberation, by saying the oppressed will be set free, that the prisoners will be set free, that the blind will receive sight, and the lame will walk, and by saying go and conquer, it does not make sense. So when Jesus comes to this part here and says, go and proclaim, what he's saying is, go out and proclaim liberation. Be a vision of liberation. Be part of communities that are liberating and liberating and liberating. And then baptize. Now that's the piece that I want to spend more time on, and I'm not going to do a lot of that today, but I'm more and more fascinated with this idea of our baptismal identity overcoming all of the divisions in our society, minds, and hearts. We become brothers and sisters to people we may not even like very well. And maybe some of you don't like your brothers and sisters very well. But it doesn't matter because they're still part of the family, right? And so we have to work for just and loving relationships in all ways. See, this wasn't going to be about rejecting or accepting the Trinity today. Whether you do or not really is of no consequence. What is of consequence is how we will live. It's not enough to say, yeah, I don't really buy that. Okay, fine. How will you live out the liberating call of Jesus Christ? What is that baptismal identity? It is not right belief. It's not about joining with other folks who seem to see the world just like we do. It is about joining a life-giving, life-affirming, actionable community who seeks to follow Jesus. The question then is, in all of this, how will we know for sure we're participating? Well, the honest answer is we may never know for sure, but here's a way to be at least aware. How will we know? Ask these questions. Does it bring life? Is it life-affirming? Will this liberate and be liberating? Does this affirm the God-given identity of all people? Are these relationships just and loving? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then we can be sure that God is not calling us to do them. But that is fairly straightforward. So on this day when we talk about the Trinity, I want to give thanks for the piece that we talk about the Trinity being mystery, which means that no matter how hard we try, no matter how many books are published, no matter how many trees die in the name of the Trinity, we will never fully understand it. But if we wait, and that's why, if we wait to understand it, or to believe it, or to grasp it before we move to act, then we have missed the point altogether. This is why I push us back. I said in the Doctrine of Ministry course this week, I have to prepare a sermon on the Trinity, so I'm going to talk about Jesus. And that's why we go back to the witness of Jesus. It shows us how to live in the here and now. It raises this calling for each one of us in our own lives, in the places that we work, in the places where we live, to live as liberated people despite the external circumstances of our lives, and to recognize and to then work for the places where people are concretely oppressed today. Whatever group is being excluded, most recently to garner power or to raise fear in people, that's the group of people where Jesus is calling us to go and to be in solidarity with. That is the calling of the baptized folks who claim this sense of the Trinity. Believe it or not, but for our own sake, for the sake of the world, let us live out the divine mandate for liberation found at the heart